Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 12th of August. Today we're looking at some really important updates from the Kursk region. We'll also look at the border with Belgorod. There are some clashes over there, and we'll finish off by looking at now the Battle of Toretsk as the Russians have reached the city itself. As we zoom in, we're going to start from the west and work our way to the southeast. In this region, I have now marked Nikolaevka, Darino as under Ukrainian control, given the fact that it is so close to the border, so close to these rear concentrations in various other villages under the control of the Ukrainians, and the fact we haven't seen any proof to indicate the Russians are even in anywhere near this area. Like, we don't have verification of the Russians in Biahovo or along this road leading into Snagost. And so it's very likely the Ukrainians have been able to take it. And this is what's being reported now by deep states after their initial sort of disputes of Ukraine's capture of said village. Now, what we do know is that over the past 24 hours, sources such as Rybar have said that the Russians were able to repel the Ukrainian assaults in the Snagost area and retake it. And then now there are Ukrainian efforts to launch a counterattack through their positions in Obuchovka. And so based on that alone, I could say that it is pretty likely that the Ukrainians are present in Obuchovka. Now, Snagost itself, it is very confusing. This is one of the villages where we just have zero idea, because we know that in the initial sort of 48 hours, there probably was a Ukrainian presence in Snagost, and even in villages to the west, like this one over here, Krasnuty Barskoy. And we do know that, of course, residents from the area reported Ukrainian troops over there. And even now, Rybar can say for sure that the Russians have been able to retake it. But ever since those initial first 2 days, we don't have any sort of elaboration, any sort of videos to back up a Ukrainian presence here. It could still be the case, but this is one of those areas that is really just shrouded by ambiguity. But just to give you guys the Ukrainian perspective, Deep State, for instance, they don't show Snagost as under the control of Ukrainians. And then Rybar, for instance, they show that there are current attacks towards the village. And so it would make sense from a Ukrainian perspective to try to fight over here and get control over additional portions of fields just south of Karenovo in the effort to secure, of course, the heights that are overlooking it. But in terms of the more serious assaults towards the city, they're not occurring from the south. They're occurring more so from the north. And again, both sides are to varying degrees reporting about this. First of all, Deep State, they show a very deep axis of a Ukrainian advance along this same road, where the Ukrainians have already launched two significant attacks since their opening offensive. Both were sort of kept at bay by the Russian forces that are now reorganizing this area, sending in additional reinforcements, artillery, tanks, whatever it may be. And so they do have a strong presence here. Where they don't have a strong presence is really on the flanks. So for instance, on the southern flank, there's really no presence at all, like we said before. And of course, Ukrainian DRGs are always taking advantage of this. And this is the biggest issue with reporting on the Kursk front. During the nighttime, you do have not large in the sense that the individual DRG groups are large, but just a large amount of DRG squads in general that disperse across various axes that are compromise, you could say, where there isn't a strong Russian presence, and advance rather deep. We could see that maximum extents are maybe 12, 14 kilometers northwards or westwards, eastwards, whatever it may be, and they're able to reach certain villages, and then from there, the rumor mill begins, and then that's how you get the initial information coming from certain Telegram channels that are panicking or want to spread panic of a breakthrough. And that's something that is very beneficial to the Ukrainians, because again, the Russian communication here isn't that good. It's not very cohesive. A lot of it is just totally jammed. And so then it creates a lot of panic within the Russian side and more generally online. And so if we're going to zoom in, as I said before, also on the northern flank of Karenovo, this is an area where we don't see many Russian forces yet. What we do know is that there are very heavy clashes going on within Olgovka. It appears that the Ukrainians may be partially in control of Olgovka and that they were able to actually pass through the village. So this may be either a DRG efforts or actual mobile mechanized forces during the day trying to get control of a more solid area and actually passing through Vitreno and beginning to actually clash with Russian forces just north of Karenovo in this village here, Tolpino, which just is so weird when you think about it, because it defies logic of a static front line, but that's the fluid nature of the fighting here. And so I'm not even going to map it at this current point in time because we don't have enough proof. but Tolpino was mentioned by Rybar itself and by various other sources on both sides. And so just think of it that there may be clashes here. There may be some sort of infiltration. Maybe it's been repelled by now, but definitely that was mentioned. What was also mentioned is that you had a rather serious attempt by the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. They, at least two of their companies were involved in this, and they, of course, utilized their various mechanized assets. Could be strikers, could be certain types of BTRs, martyrs. All of them are being used at this point. There's a really wide variety of both more advanced Soviet weaponry and then also NATO weaponry that is being utilized with the Ukrainians. And a lot of it was put to use with this raid towards Tolpino by the 82nd, and then it was aided by DRG raids from the 88th Air Assault Brigade, which is accompanying the 82nd. And at the same time, you also had direct assaults towards Karanovo from probably the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade. And so you saw this sort of coordinated attack going on and off throughout the day. In the village of Volkovka, the Russians were able to sort of hold off the Ukrainian attack, but because really you're able to penetrate deeper in because there isn't that much of a Russian troop density here, the Ukrainians were able to at least fight in the Tolpino region. In Kremenoye, this is an area where the Ukrainians tried attacking and the Russians repelled them. So here we have footage of the Russians filming Ukrainian KIA within the village. And then let's see what's this marker over here. It's a video from the Ahmad forces. They filmed a destroyed Ukrainian Rochelle Senator, Canadian military armored car in the village. So that was used to infiltrate in. And that was actually involved probably in the 88th Brigade's activities. And so whatever Ahmad unit is here, it could be one of the regiments like Sever Ahmads. Some of them are located here. Some of them are located further to the southeast. But in any case, that's not the end of the story, because there were reports yesterday, August 11th, of Ukrainian infiltrations into Zhirovli. These were really notable sort of infiltrations by mechanized assets. They could be DRG elements. You see it over here. There was actually a Lancet that hit them. And so that's occurred earlier. And since then, there has been a bit of a gray zone forming around here. So there isn't full understanding of whether the Russians have been able to solidify control there, because now we're also receiving information of Ukrainian infiltrations occurring even further north in Obchi Kolodez. And if we're looking at the distance between the current line of contact that I've estimated, it is about 12 kilometers away. So again, that shows you that there is not enough of a Russian density here from the reinforcements to completely push off these Ukrainian DRGs. And that specific village is pretty close to Lgov in comparison to where the current line of contact is. It's about like 20, 22 kilometers away. And so you could see how the Ukrainian infiltrations do continue even a week after we saw the initial assaults. Now, if we're going a bit to the east to get an understanding of the situation, there are also DRG attacks here. So, for instance, in Kruglenkoy, this is an area where the Russians have been able to retake control. So the reinforcements here have been successful in this X region. And that's really important because these areas really are forested, not really roads here, but there are open fields and a hill that overlooks both the valley to the west and the road to the east. But apparently along the same road that sort of starts in Malaya Loknia, it's currently under Ukrainian control, and they're able to utilize it to advance further northwards. And so we've seen now for several days these sort of DRG infiltrations into areas like Semenovka. We had footage of that. Now there's actually information coming out from Russian sources of an even deeper infiltration into the village of Kromsky Biki. And so if we're going to zoom out and measure the distances here, it's a Ukrainian infiltration amounting to about 14 kilometers deep. So yeah, that really is a significant number. But what isn't being accounted for with these reports is what happens afterwards with these vehicles. Because sure, a lot of them are able to conduct their activities, for instance, getting reconnaissance information or ambushing whatever Russian reinforcements are coming in. The downside is that there really isn't a way for them to respond to the very strong Russian response that is currently occurring, first with their Air Force. A lot of the Air Force has been activated to here. About 50% of the FAB bombs that are being dropped are now dropped in this part of the front line. And then also we have the lower lying helicopter crews that are coming in to engage. Some of them, of course, have been shot down, as we talked about. But the ones that haven't, of course, they're trying to wreak havoc, and they're firing ATGMs towards the Ukrainian vehicles. You have, of course, the armored vehicles of the Russian side getting involved, trying to target the Ukrainian mechanized assets. You have Lancet drones that are really involved in a large amount of the mechanized forces getting targeted. Iskanders, MLRS systems, you name it. There's a very long list of various means by which the Russians are targeting these mechanized forces. And a lot of the time, that's what happens to these DRG units, or they get attacked and then they're forced to disperse before the operation is complete. That also happens a lot. And so just going a bit to the southeast, the situation in Martinovka is still rather ambiguous. What's being mentioned by Ukrainian sources is that they've been able to take control of Kruglik and that they are involved right now in an effort to really push out the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade from their positions in Martinovka, because that unit was able to get control over the village yesterday on the 11th. And so now there's a concerted effort, according to these sources, from the 22nd Brigade and perhaps even the 88th Brigade to push from the north, where there is a hill that overlooks part of Martinovka, and then push from the valleys that are to the west of the R200 and then actually infiltrate into the village. And so you could see how there's this sort of envelopment going on, but we don't know if it's been successful in actually pushing out the 810th completely. And this is so important because Martinovka, as we said before, acts as a conduit between the rest of the Russian garrison in Kursk and the actual defenders that are within the eastern part of Sudzha. And so it is very understandable that really, despite the unfavorable conditions just based on the flanks being very, very deprived and due to really large issues with supplying, the 810th is trying to hold on for as long as possible in order to ensure that there are no encirclements and no mass casualty events within eastern Sudzha, where you do still have elements of the 488th Regiment defending, but they have lost a lot of territory recently, and there are already murmurs within both sides about the inevitable capture of Sudzha. Now, it hasn't happened yet, so I don't want to say it with full certainty, but what I will say is that over the past 2 days, the Ukrainians have been able to cross over, I think it is the Psel River over here, or maybe I'm mistaken, but this river over here, the Reka Sudzha River, and they've been able to capture suburbs Zomche and Makhanovka. And so that's an advance, if we're looking at it, amounting to around 2 kilometers eastwards, reaching all the way to Dmitriukov. And they are now really undermining that southern flank of the Russian, not really pocket, but I guess you could call it salient at the moment. It could soon turn into really a big envelopment. And so you have Russian elements within Mirny and in some of these industrial areas, warehouses, also some of the residential areas, but now a lot of that has been diminished due to the Ukrainians crossing over the river. And so you see pressure from the south, where you have 61st Brigade operating to a certain extent. You have 88th Brigade, as we said before. And then to the north, 22nd Brigade, they've been able to solidify control over the ring road that connects Sudzha to then Martinovka and then further to the northeast. And from there, they've been able to advance southwards several hundred meters. Let's look at it, about 1 kilometer southwards, take over additional houses here. And there's actually geolocations to verify these advances. And you could see that you have some Ukrainians that are driving around northern Sudzha now. That confirms their presence here. And so there's also a push coming in from that northern direction that puts Mirny and some of these other villages here like Bondarevka in really serious danger, because they're not really connected to the rest of the Russian garrisons here. There isn't a large Russian reinforcement in this region besides in Martinovka, and then also northwards in Bolshoi Soldatskoy. That is pretty far away, and the roads that are connecting to these villages here, they are really scant in quantity, and also in quantity they're not that good. And then you could already see how the Ukrainians have been able to create this large flank from the north, where if they get control of Martinovka, they have control of the heights, and that would put the really defenders here in a low-lying valley east of a river in a lot of danger. And so that is something that the Ukrainians are trying to achieve now. And we're going to have to wait and see whether there are enough reinforcements coming from the Russian side that we talked about yesterday that are able to stabilize the situation here and prevent the full capture and full undermining of the flanks. Now, looking a bit southwards, we've seen recently the Ukrainians expand their sphere of operations to the area southeast of Sudzha into the Belitsa region. This is largely because you could see here just that there is this massive salient that has been created, or not necessarily salient, but just this massive gap in the defense of the Russian line that has been created due to the fact that this Belitsa region is not necessarily a part of Ukraine's initial spearhead. and so it's not receiving that attention. And it's also not a part of Belgorod Oblast, where there already has been a large concentration of the Russian northern group of forces, because they are sort of grouped around here, attacking in Liptsy and Vovchansk, and then a few others are also operating on Graivoron. And so then the region between Graivoron and the current Ukrainian offensive, it is an area that has a much lesser density of Russian forces, and it's like a 50-kilometer span of area where theoretically there are a lot of villages that could be compromised for very short periods of time and could be used to distract Russian forces and sort of spread them out. And so an area where you see that the most would be here around the Belitsa region, as it is disconnected from the Belgorod nodes, and it is also now going to be largely disconnected from the Kursk area because of the current fighting that's going on near some of those roads. And so it is the perfect area for the Ukrainians to expand, because if they're not going to be able to rapidly reach an area like Lagov or Rilsk, as they've seen now, then they should really be looking in another direction where they could try to just expand and acquire as much territory as possible. And so the area where they've seen it's most conducive to do is in Belitsa. So they've already started to infiltrate into this area by crossing past the Psal River from Grevo, taking over Plechovo. They've also been able to infiltrate through the border, and so that's something that we're seeing here. And the information here, it was really maximalist yesterday, and I was warning of that. And it appears that, as always, truth is somewhere in between. There definitely were Ukrainian, at least DRG efforts here, and they were repelled in a lot of instances, but it's not like they were non-existent in the first place. Like, they definitely did occur, and we have video footage to back it up, that there were rather deep holes in the Russian border here that allowed the Ukrainians to infiltrate rather deep into their line. And so what we know for sure is that there were reports from local Russian sources of clashes in Borky, Spalnoy, then eastwards in Kamishnoy, and then as far east as the Belaya region. But again, that really is not verified now, and it does not appear there is any serious Ukrainian encampment in that area. The farthest verified extent is in Giri, and that's very important as a village because it is located just south of Belitsa. And then from there, you have the Psel River, and you have the crossings to reach that actual village, which acts as a sort of fabric of this entire sort of theater that the Ukrainians have shifted focus to. And so you did have earlier this morning, it was like 7:30 a.m., was reported by the local sources that at least 4 of the Ukrainian BTR-4Es were sent. And I'd say that they may have been sent some from the south over here from this direction, because it's an area that is not really well defended at the moment. And then also from the Spalnoy and the Plechovo region, there were some vehicles sent in. And so you had this sort of two-pronged attack by DRG elements, where they were able to infiltrate into the southern portion of Giri through this road over here, you could say, or through these fields here, and then also through the roads to the east from Kamishnoy, and then sort of rendezvous in the southern part of Gri. And once they did that, they were spotted by the Ahmad forces that were located in this region, and they, of course, responded with their own ambush towards the Ukrainian forces. And so we have a lot of videos documenting what happened, and now the dust has really settled after nearly sort of 18 hours since that occurred. We now know that at least 4 BTR-4Es were destroyed during this engagement, and those sort of BTRs, which have only been introduced into service over the past 10 years, they are largely used by Ukraine's Air Force or by their National Guard, and we know that both of those sort of elements of the Ukrainian army, they are located over here. And so if we're zooming in, you'll see here that there was this Ahmad's video where they're parading the BTR-4E, and this is following video where they use this RPG to target a column. You could see at least 2 of those BTRs in the video, so there was some sort of RPG fire from the soldiers directly. Another area where we saw them was a bit further north over here. This is where 2 Russian BTR-82s destroyed one of the BTR-4s, and then at the end you could see how the Ukrainian crew gets out trying to escape before the vehicle gets just completely destroyed. And then over here to the southeast, you saw the furthest extent of the Ukrainian sort of infiltration, and Russian drones, they dropped grenades and launched FEVs towards 2 of those BTRs, and so that led to the destruction of them, as can be seen in the videos. And so again, at least 4, and that shows that this attack was repelled, and that, of course, those resources are now gone. And this is becoming a big issue with these sort of mechanized assets, because a lot of these units, their main strength is the fact that they do have an abundance of vehicles even after all this time, especially NATO weaponry. And a lot of it during these DRG operations, it is at the highest risk compared to the day-to-day fighting. And so, yeah, that does definitely put more of an emphasis on the way in which these resources are utilized in a way that is not too wasteful. And so we know that generally in this region, it is a very small amount that are actually conducting the raids. So far, it could change, obviously, and they're mainly from Georgian Legion, maybe from the RDK, and then there has to be some sort of regular Ukrainian army integration given the vehicles that we sell over there. But for now, the Russians have been able to prevent any sort of permanent infiltration very deep into the line here. So now moving southwards, we're going to look at the border for a second, because there were reports from Russian sources of clashes in at least 4 areas. We saw clashes here in Perelse, and a lot of these villages you're going to see, they are, just due to the nature of the Ukrainian-Russian border, they are located in these sort of, I'd say, appendices. Like this is sort of appendix gets formed over here. It's sort of sticking out, and then it makes it exposed. And there are also forests leading into it that largely overlook the village. And so then it makes it perfect for Ukrainian DRGs to sort of quickly enter in and then exit. And then they also have the roads nearby to utilize for their entrance and exits. Looking further south, there were also reports. This is where we had the most significant clashes in Kolotoivka. And there were actually fights using tanks to try crossing over. I think it was 3 to 4 tanks trying to cross the border over here along the highway to actually infiltrate into the village. You also had, of course, small arms fire, Russian drones engaging with the Ukrainians. They were located near this border crossing. They were, of course, spotted near the Dragon's Teeth that were stationed over there and, of course, targeted. And so far, the attacks have been repelled onto that village. A bit further south, if we're looking at it, there were also reports of attacks towards Tarabono. And here you could see it for yourself. There's this massive forest with the DRGs are using, and that's how they were able to actually get in. But so far, the Russians have kept them at bay. And then also here in Dronovka, again, an salient, again, surrounded by forests, again, located on a valley. It fits a very similar profile. It's been attempted to be raided into, but so far, the Russians, again, are safe over there. And we said the same thing about Peros, the Russians holding off the Ukrainians over there after they were able to initially get into that region. And so far, again, it is very small-scale attacks here. Not enough information about a large Ukrainian grouping to sort of assume that there is going to be any sort of larger activity. But of course, that could change, and the Ukrainians would really like to keep those sort of organization points secret, as they did with the initial offensive into the Kursk Oblast in the first place. Now, looking at Toretsk, we're going to zoom in and look at some of the very significant gains from here. We can see now that the entirety of the sort of Donbass line that was built by the Ukrainians starting around 2014, but again, heavily expanded. Also in 2016, there were some large additions to it. And ever since, of course, there have been, especially since the beginning of the war. And now that entire initial line from the 2014 demarcation era has been completely taken over by the Russians due to their most recent advance. So beginning just to the southwest of New York, we have additional confirmation of Russian advances near Pantelemonivka, and it's an advance that, if we look at it, 0.75 square kilometers, and then a bit to the south, we also have this Russian gain. So the Russians really are serious here about consolidating control over the entirety of the field that runs parallel to New York and parallel to Sudzha Balka over here. They're very serious about this. They have been conducting advances every few days and are now shaping the battlefield in a way that makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to continue defending in Pantelemonivka and by extension in Alexandropil. Although Alexandropil is more defended due to the trenches and due to it being on a certain height, the village to the north is on low-lying valley that is just completely dominated by the regions that the Russians are currently passing through. We could see that the Russians advanced about 1 kilometer here, and that does more generally put a lot of stress on the Sudzha Balka, which really is important because it acts as a coordinating point between New York. Even now that the road has been largely cut off, it could still act as a conduit through the sort of oval connection or semicircle connection. And then a bit to the west, it connects to various other key Ukrainian defense nodes like Stara Mykolivka. And so, yeah, that's the general goal for the Russians, to undermine that connection. Then to the east, this is really important. Ever since that salient was sort of closed off by the Russians and the Ukrainians withdrew, it became evident to everyone that it wouldn't be the final major advance because there were still these sort of remnants of the Ukrainian 2014 line, trenches, valleys, ponds, forested regions that were still either under Ukrainian control or in a gray zone in the southeastern approaches of New York. And just based on the shape of the front line, it was not realistic that the Ukrainians would be able to maintain control of them for much longer. And so now we see a Russian advance northwards of about 2 kilometers. The Ukrainians just completely abandoning any sort of salient in their minds. And instead, they have congregated around this sort of eastern district of New York. A lot of this very compact defense is now occurring within the populated area. But the Russians have been able to take over, as we said before, large amount of trenches that really were well defended, well mined, well gunned as well. And you could see that they've been able to infiltrate into the first houses of New York from this direction. And this gives them additional momentum, a very strong vector of attack into the center of New York itself. And it's going to occur now along a new axis, not just from directly from the south, but also from the southeast. And it's occurring now through a low-lying region. So there's not much of an elevation component to the area that the Russians just captured. But you can see that the Russians were also able to capture a large portion of the valley south of Zalizhnya and Pivdenia, which just makes sense to me because once the Russians got full control of the heights, including the quarries and the slag heaps that are located north of the Ukrainian defense line, it just became obvious that the Ukrainians would not be able to hold on over there. And the reason why is because they would just be completely overlooked in their static defenses or in their forests by the Russians that are now in those new taken over territories. And so now you're seeing the natural consequences that the Ukrainians realized the attrition rates just weren't worth it and they were squeezed out by the Russians. And again, they're consolidating further westwards and they have to run back to New York or to Nelipivka. And that gives the Russians the access to take over the new gray zone. So the Russians advance the maximum amount of, if we're going to measure it out, let's see, it's an advance amounting to around, 2.3 kilometers. And if we're measuring the total extent, then it is 10 square kilometers. So that is a really large advance. But again, it did happen in a rather quick period of time. But the entire process of setting up the conditions that allowed for this capture did really play out over the past 2 months. Now, what this means is that Zalizhnya is now completely under Russian control. It also means that the Ukrainians have a new salient that they have to try to deal with and defend, because you do see this mini salient, including some forested areas, some trenches along this road, some trenches over here to protect the northeastern flank of New York. And all of them are, again, lower lying areas, not necessarily overlooked immediately by all the Russian positions, but they are overlooked to the north from Pivdenia and from parts of Zalizhnya. And so the Russians do also have the elevation advantage, are enveloping it from three sides. And the loss of this sort of salient that you see bulging over here would spell the end for New York. It would spell the end for the hundreds, if not thousands, of troops that are generally operating in this region, because then you'd have a Russian attack coming in from the east towards the center of New York, towards the gravity where they are currently holding on to. And that would also spell the end of Nelipivka. And so you can see how the battlefield is already being shaped for the next step of the battles over here. So just keep an eye out for that. But looking a bit northwards, I do want to look at this deep state updates, which confirms that the Russian forces have been able to infiltrate deeper into Toretsk, this time just completely bypassing Pivnishnya. What this means is that there may not be a strong enough Ukrainian ground-based response to the Russian advances. Of course, the drone crews are very active, and you have to give them a lot of credit, because I've seen firsthand the sort of actions that they perform on this part of the front line, the Voron group in particular, but also the Umbrella unit from the 32nd Brigade. So they're definitely active here, and that is an incentive for the Russians to not be too maximal in their advances and how comfortable they are in the open. But despite that fact, there's not enough pushback when the Russians are advancing through these residential areas. And the consequence is that they've been able to advance about 1.4 kilometers westwards along the key highway leading directly into Toretsk. They're not been able to actually get control of many houses. If you zoom in, they have control over some roads that are on the fringes of Pivnishnya. Now, what this infiltration does mean is that there is a lot of pressure from the northern flank on the Ukrainians that are still holding on to the remnants of the diagonal defense line that we've talked about so much, that I'm marking with this red line over here. The slack heap is now going to be under a lot of pressure, and also the Russians will be able to infiltrate into these forests here, and their own DRGs will begin to actually utilize it as a playground, sort of, where they can then advance and harass whatever Ukrainian defenders are trying to build up defenses on the perimeter of Turets itself. So that could happen within this suburb over here that you see with the dachas. It could happen near the government office, near the other slag keeps. And then again, you could also see that occurring here with the forested regions that are located just south of southern Turets. And so again, the Ukrainians do have a vested interest in pushing back the Russians here, not completely out of Pivnishnya, but at least away from this yellow marker here, in order to really maintain the integrity of their defense line. In addition, what it means that it is that in Pivnishnya itself, there is likely not a strong Ukrainian garrison anymore, and it is largely just a gray zone, which means that the Russian forces eventually will be able to advance and take it over in its entirety, and then that will spell a lot of difficulties for Druzhba in its own defense. And so really keep an eye out for the situation, because the Russians have not diverted forces away from this part of the front line. The only difference is now that there are way less Air Force attacks by the Russians, where previously there were a large amount of FABs being launched. There was actually a story out from The Economist today where they talked about the 103rd Brigade. They talked about how they were targeted by FABs and that 12 men in their company were killed directly by a FAB, just one. And that was, of course, on the Kursk offensive area. And so you're seeing a lot of those FABs redirected away from here. And that is a big issue in the sense that you could be using those FABs to target various very dense and large structures in Toretsk, but that isn't stopping the actual ground forces from continuing with their gains, as they already have the momentum in the underlying geography and attrition rates on their side. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.